War II ended, Korea, ruled by Japan since 1905, was divided in half and occupied by two of the Allied powers. North of the 38th parallel, the USSR assumed the duties of maintaining order and helping the Koreans to reestablish their national entity. But the administration of North Korea, as practiced by the Russians, was characterized by much more than a friendly interest in North Korean industry and government. Soon after the start of the Russian occupation, a communist government was functioning in North Korea, guided by such native communist leaders as Soviet-trained Kim Il-sung and his henchmen. South of the 38th parallel, the Koreans made an earnest attempt to arrive at a basis for closer understanding with the occupying U.S. force. But to the South Koreans, young and old, it was difficult to comprehend the mysterious foreigners from another hemisphere who had arrived in Korea suddenly and set about introducing American methods into the life of South Korea. American occupation forces checked the spread of disease and helped the South Koreans themselves to work more effectively toward improving the national health. In South Korea, at least, the people seemed destined for a somewhat better life than they had known for centuries. By mid-1950, almost 5 years after the end of World War II, South Korea had built up an army of some 100,000 men, trained by American Army officers and non-coms. The South Koreans felt in the spring of 1950 that they could handle any attack from across the 38th parallel. But in late June, that boundary was crossed in force by the North Koreans. The communist thrust across the 38th parallel heralded the beginning of one of the most tragic periods in the history of the Korean people. The South Korean forces had proved pitifully inadequate for the job of withstanding the invaders. For the citizens of the infant Republic of Korea, whose independence had been proudly proclaimed less than 2 years before, the immediate future looked all but hopeless. The unquiet peace which had existed among the great powers of the world since World War II was at an end. In the U.S., at Lake Success, the United Nations, with the Soviet member conspicuously absent, took enforcement action against the aggressor.
48 hours ago, the Security Council, in an emergency session, determined that the armed invasion of the Republic of Korea by armed forces from Northern Korea constituted a breach of the peace. Accordingly, the Security Council called for a cessation of hostilities forthwith and the withdrawal of the Northern Korean authorities of their armed forces to the 38th parallel. It is clear that the authorities in North Korea have completely disregarded and flouted the decision of the Security Council. The armed invasion of the Republic of Korea continues. This is, in fact, an attack on the United Nations itself.
Agreed that the armed attack upon the Republic of Korea constituted a breach of the peace, the United Nations of the world took decisive action.
To secure peace and security recommends that the members of the United Nations furnish such assistance to the Republic of Korea as may be necessary to repel the armed attack and to restore international peace and security in the area.
In Korea, for the first time, enforcement action was taken against an aggressor by direction of the United Nations.
On 28 June, aircraft of the United States Air Force, operating pursuant to the resolution of the Security Council of the United Nations, began air operations against the North Korean invaders in support of Republic of Korea forces and later struck at military targets north of the 38th parallel with a view to disrupting the lines of communication and supply of the invading forces. The badly decimated Republic of Korea forces reformed south of the Han River, sought to delay the North Korean advance. By sheer weight of numbers and materiel, they were forced back step by step until on 2 July, the town of Suwon, 20 miles south of Seoul, was reported in North Korean hands. Meanwhile, in pursuance of United Nations recommendations, United States ground forces were committed to the area for stabilization of the front. On 5 July, a very small United States force made contact with the invaders south of Suwon. The first United States troops were small in number and were committed as a holding force only. They were followed by additional supporting forces as rapidly as these could be transported to the battle line, facing odds at times as high as 20 to 1. Our Army troops distinguished themselves in the most difficult of military operations, a delaying action.
The first UN heroes were American GIs of the 24th Division. In the deserted villages of South Korea, the nations of the free world would shortly make their stand against the forces of aggression. In Tokyo, the appointment of General Douglas MacArthur as commander of United Nations forces celebrated in a ceremony conducted by U.S. Army Chief of Staff, General Lawton Collins. During the first weeks of fighting, South Korean and American forces were pushed back toward the tip of the Korean Peninsula and the prospect of another Dunkirk. The outnumbered UN forces took heavy losses during that first month in the desperate fight for time. On July 31st, elements of the 1st Marine Division arrived at Busan, swelling the force of American fighting men in Korea to some 100,000. The battle to keep the enemy from overrunning all of Korea approached its most critical stage. Men and materiel were now arriving from the U.S. in some quantity. 7,000 miles away at Lake Success, New York, on the following day, August 1st marked the return to the United Nations Security Council of the hitherto absent Soviet member, Yakub Malik, who assumed the presidency of the Council for the month of August. The discussion of the Korean aggression flared into violent and bitter debate at intervals throughout Soviet delegate Malik's month as the Security Council's president.
The USSR delegation declares to the Security Council and to the public opinion of the world that the United States resolution is intended to extend the scale of the United States government's aggression against the Korean people.
When the president, as such, or as the representative of the Soviet Union, it makes no difference which hat he wears while he's doing it, but when he undertakes to persuade this great audience here present and in all the world outside that the United States of America is an aggressor in Korea, I'd like to ask whose troops are attacking deep in the country of somebody else? Whose troops? The North Koreans. Who is assisting the Republic of Korea to defend itself? The United Nations. with the support of 53 out of 59 members. Is the Soviet Union one of the 53? No.
The United States government is now making every effort to extend its scope to wage war on an increasingly large scale, to drag as many other governments as possible into this war, not only against the people of Korea, but also against the other people of Asia. The whole world knows that armed intervention in the internal affairs of Korean people, armed aggression in Korea, is being carried out by American forces on the personal orders of President Truman and under the command of the American General MacArthur.
Now let us consider the trick of concealing guilt through accusation. The classic example of this trick, of course, is that of the thief who is running away. And he cries, "Stop thief, stop thief," at the honest man ahead of him in order to confuse his pursuers. The Soviet delegate referred several times to, quote, "the aggression of which the United States is guilty against the Korean people," end quote. This statement has been repeated over and over through every Soviet-inspired channel on earth. We've had it telegraphed to us by others, and we've heard it again today. It is a lie. It is a big lie to call the action of those governments who are seeking to support the resolutions of the Security Council acts of aggression. It is a falsehood so grotesque that even the technique of the big lie will not disguise it. The determination of the United Nations to ensure that Korea shall be free, unified, and independent of outside influence from any great power on or off the continent has never wavered. This is what the United Nations forces are fighting to uphold in Korea. It is a supreme effort to give the Korean people the right to control their own destinies, a right that so many countries caught in a net of imperialism with a new name, communist imperialism, have lost.
In Korea, the identity of the aggressor was no mystery. By late August, the North Korean forces had seized most of South Korea, except for an area surrounding the port of Busan. With their backs to the sea, American forces fought desperately to hold their ground against the powerful enemy drive. The crucial battle was fought in the hills flanking Taegu. It was a bruising fight for the bone-weary American GIs. But they never gave up the battle. In holding the Busan perimeter, the American forces suffered heavily. But the enemy offensive was beaten back. Thanks to the sacrifices of American fighting men, Korea did not become a communist peninsula. By early September, the Busan perimeter was no longer in immediate danger of being overrun. On September 15th, the tide of battle turned by virtue of a daring amphibious attack at Incheon. The attack force which made the assault on Korea's west coast was engaged in an extremely difficult operation. An operation undertaken at the insistence of General MacArthur. The problems of fluctuating tides, unpredictable currents, and narrow channels made the success of the Incheon landing a doubtful quantity. The burden of responsibility for risking the forces committed in an operation which might well prove a failure rested with General MacArthur. 12,000 Marines, many veterans of World War II, headed for shore in the first amphibious assault of the Korean War. With the Marines who stormed the beaches at Valmy and Incheon was Time Life correspondent Frank Gibney, also a veteran of the war with Japan.
Some of the Marines in the assault had been brought from duty in the Mediterranean. Others had been pulled out of the line in southern Korea. Incheon had to be taken to cut the enemy's communications with the southern front and to trap thousands of his troops in between. The Marines didn't give the enemy time to recover from the surprise attack on his flank. Progress was swift. Many of the Marines I was with were past masters at flushing enemy troops out of holes, an acquired talent they never lost. Hundreds of North Koreans were killed on that overcast September morning, D-Day at Incheon. The surprised North Korean troops had failed completely in their hurried attempt to beat off the amphibious attack. The operation was a spectacular success, a proud day for General MacArthur, whose judgment was vindicated, and for Marine General O.P. Smith.
On the southern front, the situation had changed considerably by virtue of the Incheon operation. For the enemy, the battle had taken a turn for the worse. U.S. 8th Army GIs smashed into enemy positions with renewed spirit and moved slowly but steadily forward. In the Incheon area, the Marines stepped up the attack in a drive to take Seoul as quickly as possible. On September 24th, only 10 days after D-Day at Incheon, U.S. Marines and soldiers were fighting in Seoul. The fight for the South Korean capital was bloody, but relatively brief. For 5 days, the battle for Seoul raged on. The U.S. troops took their losses, but efficiently stamped out enemy resistance. 3 months after the communist invasion, Seoul was once again free. Thousands returned to the homes they had abandoned before the communist thrust overwhelmed the Korean Republic's capital. Other thousands upon thousands had stayed on during the communist occupation. As soon as the fight for Seoul was ended, they fell to work, rebuilding their badly battered city. For the inhabitants of Seoul, life was a good deal more makeshift than it had been before the communist invasion. Government officials of the Republic of Korea who returned to Seoul after its recapture addressed the inhabitants, who had been subjected to daily doses of communist propaganda, on South Korea's immediate problems. During the summer of 1950, many thousands of South Koreans were killed by their countrymen from the north. Whatever the future held for Korea, it could hardly prove more tragic than the early years of the infant republic's existence. In many lands, freedom had been achieved by bloodshed, but nowhere was newly won freedom put to a stronger test than in the Republic of Korea. By early autumn, fighting forces from other member countries of the United Nations arrived in South Korea to join the struggle in defense of South Korean independence. To that crusade, Britain committed some 5,000 soldiers. Several of the nations which had fought in the Pacific during World War II sent troops to South Korea. 1,000 Filipino soldiers and 1,000 Australians swelled the ranks of the United Nations forces. The diggers from down under, who had fought so well in the steaming jungles of New Guinea 8 years before, were determined to add further laurels to their battlefield record in Korea. On October 1st, South Korean troops pushed northward across the 38th parallel, 3 months and 1 week after the communist attack. As the ROK's, Republic of Korea soldiers, seized more and more territory in their northward drive, there were impromptu celebrations commemorating the liberation of the area. The Koreans along the route seemed genuinely happy to greet the advancing ROK forces. The city of Kaesong, just south of the 38th parallel, was seized by Americans of the 1st Cavalry Division on October 8th. The GIs then drove quickly north to the well-publicized boundary, which the UN had authorized its forces to cross. By October 15th, United Nations troops had swept across the 38th parallel and seized a considerable area in North Korea. 2,500 miles east, Wake Island was the scene of a most important engagement that mid-October morning. President Harry Truman had flown 7,000 miles to talk with his top general in the Far East, a man he had never before met. They conferred for 1 hour in complete privacy, and then held a more general discussion in one of Wake Island's few buildings. This conference included the President's top military advisors, Joint Chiefs Chairman Bradley and Army Secretary Pace. Before the meeting broke up, a decoration ceremony was held, to the delight of the photographers. Though only the two men knew what had been said at the secret meeting, they claimed to be in complete agreement. On October 20th, ROK soldiers and American GIs seized the North Korean capital of Pyongyang. After 5 years, the communist hold on that city had been broken by the UN forces. 2 days later, 120 troop carrier planes transported paratroopers of the 187th Airborne Regiment to an area some 25 miles north of Pyongyang. Over the target area near Sukchan and Suncheon, the paratroopers hit the silk. General MacArthur cruised above the area, watching the initial stage of the operation. The 800-foot drop took each man only about a minute. The operation went off smoothly. The drop was made at precisely the points indicated in the original planning. The trap on the enemy was sprung. Some 30,000 North Koreans were bottled up between the UN forces in Pyongyang to the south and the men of the 187th Airborne Regiment. The North Koreans were completely taken by surprise by this unfamiliar maneuver. On North Korea's east coast, off Wonsan, U.S. minesweepers went to work on clearing out one of the most intensive sea minefields in military history. The job was done by laying magnetic lines. Finally, after a 6-day delay, the landing at Wonsan was made by advance elements of the 1st Marine Division. But this landing was not in the tradition of marine amphibious invasions, for the area had already been taken 2 weeks earlier by other UN troops. Though the landing was no problem, the Marines had been alerted to expect plenty of action when they reached shore and began the push along the east coast of the peninsula. The Marines' first assignment was to mop up a large group of organized North Korean guerrillas. The job was done efficiently by men who were experienced in that line of work. The Marines fighting along the East Coast were part of the U.S. 10th Corps, a combined Marine Army force commanded by U.S. Army Major General Edward Almond, who reported directly to General MacArthur in Tokyo. On Korea's west coast, Lieutenant General Walton Walker commanded the U.S. 8th Army. Both U.S. forces were driving pell-mell toward the northern boundary of Korea. That objective received the full attention of both 8th Army and 10th Corps commanders, who did not coordinate their movements but reported independently to Tokyo. The frozen Yalu, which separates Korea from Manchuria, was reached at the North Korean town of Haesanjin by GIs of the 7th Division. Most of the men felt that this achievement signaled the answer to their prayers, the end of the war, and a chance to get home for Christmas. But the GIs did not realize on that cold November afternoon that an even greater enemy across the Yalu was about to attack. On November 26th, in a move which stunned the UN forces, the Chinese Reds hurled their armies into North Korea and drove deep into the soft